Chapter 9, we are looking at adding materials, a little bit of rendering, and how we can pull everything together then to finish off our sheets. In this exercise, we'll be loading up the materials and applying some of the more basic ones. Then we'll be looking at some of the other settings in a bit. But as you are looking at this series, because you're probably interested in architecture and construction, I thought it would be a good idea for you to sort of have a go at finishing some of this stuff off as well. I'll start you off. We'll do all the sort of below ground work and add some of the other bits and pieces. So first of all, we're going to load up the materials. So on our materials window, we click on the details button and open or create a collection. And then chapter 9, we've got the materials and rendering chapter. Inside that, there's one called the material pack. Let's select that folder. And now all our materials are loaded in. Okay, so that's the first thing that we can do. And if we come down to the bottom, we'll start off with the earth. So click on earth and apply that. That's good enough for that. Get a little bit of sort of stratering as well. Underneath the earth, we've got ground cover gravel. So that's for this to fill in for our pipe. And then we've got one down here, perimeter drainage pipe. So we'll sort that out. We've also then got this gravel fill. So we can choose the gravel fill. That's going to deal with this bit and this bit. So this is our sort of backfill type thing. Oh, no, sorry. The gravel fill's there for this. I beg your pardon. What I'll do is sample this by using the Alt key on Windows. I think it's the Command key on the Mac, but I'll put a little fly out there just in case you've forgotten what it is, like I have, clearly. Then we're going to use the brushed concrete for the finish up there. Okay, so before you know it, we're applying the material directly to the wrapper of the component. So it's very simple. This one, CMU concrete fill, we can use that for the foundation. And we'll also be using it for these things here. This is what the CMU concrete fill is. Now, if I want to just do the blocks that I can see, then I could just apply the CMU to the outside and that would do all of that. Okay. But because I want to just make sure I cover all the blocks and do it in one go, because I've got bits of blocks as well, I'm going to double click and then I'm going to triple click. That's going to select all of those faces in that component. And with my CMU, I'm going to apply it to all those faces. Okay, so that's actually the surfaces inside of that component. Because this thing here is inside of the component, I'm going to triple click on this as well and use this one, CMU concrete fill. And then there's a bit more. So this one here, triple click on that and apply to there as well. So now we've got our blocks done. There is a half block, which is different. So that's these ones. So again, double click, triple click, and then use your CMU. That'll sort those out as well. So now we've got all our blocks done. What we also need to do is to zoom in for our DPM, because this is a thin one. So DPM, damp proof membrane, black, sort of bituminous, rubbery, sheety thing that goes over the top. So we're looking good already. We can use the rebar for these ones. So the rebar we'll find here, even though it's sort of the metallic sort of checker plate. And again, that can be applied directly to these materials. Whoops, Control Z. And let's just click on there. I think I've probably applied it to the surface of this, but it doesn't matter. It gets overridden by the one that's on the actual surface of the object inside. So we're coming up to this bit now, and we've got some insulation. So this is insulation, this is mesh, and then this is going to be our 3-coat stucco finish. So I'll finish this bit off, and then next one we can look at some of the timbers and orientating to get that texture right on some of these timbers. So this one, I think it's the rigid insulation pink. Then we've got the mesh, and then we've got this thing which comes as one. So we need to double click, and then we're into this component. And this first bit is this thing here, the scratch coat. Okay, I'll just scroll up. So that scratch coat gets applied to this. So that's on top of the mesh. Then we can use the sand for this one. And then I think it's a concrete finish at the bottom. So if we use concrete flooring, that should be fine for this one as well. That gives it a nice little look to that. This very bottom thing here, this is anodized aluminium. So that's under A, and we can just apply that to the bottom there. So before we know it, we're looking, pretty good below ground. Inside, we've got concrete, sand, and our concrete flooring. This is going to be the blue solid insulation. Then we've got sand underneath that. We've got a mineral wool. So that's this thing here, mineral wool. We can pick that up and apply that to the various bits of wall. And similarly, inside our roof, we've got mineral wool. And then we've got this mineral wool roll as well. So we can go in and pick that up as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so the rest of it is going to be various bits of material. We've got the plasterboard, we've got the render finish on the inside, we've also got some more mesh, we've got some Tyvek down the bottom. So this thing here is the breather membrane, not the vapor barrier. So the Tyvek's come in outside, the vapor barrier goes on the inside. Okay, so we'll finish that off in a bit, but that's got us started. It's got us quite a long way, in fact. So next up, we're going to look at materials and some of the issues that we get when we try to just apply them to the wrapper of a component. Chapter 902, using the axis for texture alignment. There might be situations where, especially for timber, where the alignment or the grain of that timber isn't looking correct. And I often see situations where it's been applied and someone, because it's called timber and it has a grain, someone's applied it and they think, well, that's good enough, even though it's going in the wrong direction. And you need to make sure that all the elements look as convincing as possible. So the grain and the sort of patterns of the timber all work according to how you would expect them to work. Okay, so in this little exercise, I'm going to show you how you can do that without having to sort of edit the material, turn it through 90 degrees, and then reapply it. There's no feature in SketchUp, okay, for doing that. If I went to, say, this earth texture, which is selected, and then clicked on edit, these are the in-model ones. You can't edit things that are outside the model. And I look at this, I've got the size control, 400 by 320, but that's it. There's no rotational control on this. Now, there are plugins and all sorts of things that will allow you to sort of tweak and manipulate the textures, but I'm a bit of a purist as far as using this software goes, and I do like the sort of native format of the software. It doesn't need to be too overcomplicated. Okay, so if we go back to the texture pack, so I'll hit the drop down and come down to the bottom, material pack, should I say, not texture pack. And we've got this one here called lumber. Okay, this is for our stud work. The light timber plank is a choice whether you choose a light timber plank on the outside or the dark timber plank. I've given you two sort of options for that. We'll look at that next. But this one, lumber, if I click on that and just apply it to this component, we can see that the grain is going in the wrong direction. Okay, when you cut this, the grain will be along that way, not the way it's shown here. So instead of sort of then modifying this, making a version of it like this, because you can see the grain going that way and that one and the grain going this way, I could just apply that and it would be fine. Okay, but I want to show you how to manipulate this on these components so that it can be done. If we just right click on this, change axis, and you can see that the blue axis is going in this direction. Okay, so it's always controlled by the blue axis. So with our new axis position, let's click on the corner. If we can get the blue axis to automatically rotate through 90 degrees, then that's great. Okay, so if I've got my blue axis coming up like so, then I click once, click twice, and it's reorientated the texture. It's as easy as that. And that, because it's applied to the component, will now apply to all the other versions of the same thing. So these battens, there's one there, one there, one there, and one there. These are all done. I can look at this one as well. So this is going in the wrong direction. So once again, right click, change axis, and click to start, and then get that blue axis, if I can, round onto that. I might have to rotate it a bit. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky, and if it is, like it is proving to be in this case, then just set it once and then rotate it through 90 degrees, like so. Click, and then that's sorted out. So it does take a little bit of adjusting, but you should find that once you've got it sorted out, then everything should be fine. And I should then be able to apply to these things. And if these are the same thing, which they're not, they'll certainly be the same at the top. So that one and that one. they're okay. So it's just these ones. So if I look at this one here, again, right click, change axis, and we can see it's poking out a little bit as well. It seems to be slightly off axis, this one. If I click there, and then move it through 90 degrees, then that's done that as well. Okay, so a nice little way, instead of manipulating the texture and trying to create a new texture and then applying it, just adjust the orientation of the component itself, and then the rest of them follow suit. Okay, so it's a nice, simple way to deal with that little potential problem. These ones are fine. And then what I mean by the repeat of the material, you can see that each one of these has repeated. Now, in this case, it doesn't really matter because we're not going to be looking at them like this that often. And if we are, then we can adjust them by applying the texture to the surface and then doing a trick that I'm going to show you in the next video. Okay, but we've now applied a lot of our lumber and that's looking okay. In the next video, we'll look at getting this thing, which is the main bit of our elevation, to look as random as possible, as we don't have the repeat texture going onto each one of those. Chapter 903, adjusting texture to avoid repetition. We're going to be applying the same texture to these planks, but we're going to position the texture within the face of the component to make it look different than the one next to it. It's very important that we try to replicate reality wherever possible. And however hard we try, we'd never be able to cut the same looking piece of plank and use it over and over and over again. We can book match certain things, but in this case, we want this to look slightly different, a bit of variation that will then add to the overall effect, especially when you're going to render these things out and try to make them look as realistic as possible. So we can either use the dark timber plank or the light timber plank. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to use the dark one. And if I just sort of zoom in and apply to this, then we get this sort of repetition here. And we even find that some of these are sort of orientated in a different direction. Okay, so that to me looks completely wrong. It would never look like that. But for some people, that's kind of acceptable. But we're trying to do as good a job as we possibly can here. So we're going to strip this out and start again. So I'm just going to Control Z or Command Z on the Mac. And then if I double click to edit the component, we'll see that it's made up of individual planks. Okay, so it's not just one thing. And also when you render, the fact that we've got this sort of recess is going to add a little bit of shadow, especially when we use the ambient occlusion option in V-Ray. So if I then was to use the timber plank and apply it to the individual planks, we still get the same sort of feature. Okay, it's still not working as good as it could. So I'm going to step this back as well. So how do we get around that without making loads of different textures? Well, double click and then triple click to select all of these bits. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is provide this covering to all of the faces so that we don't get any white sort of areas. And then we're going to right click on the surface. So just make sure you selected the surface. So deselect and then just click on the surface, right click, and then you come down to texture and then position. And we can see that the texture here is quite small. It tiles, but because they're tileable textures, you don't notice an obvious edge. But in this case, we can use this blue icon and click and just drag that up. So we're stretching this and making the grain stretch a bit longer. And we can also grab the green one and pull it out a bit to the right. And again, that's going to make it slightly bigger. And then we can kind of reposition it so we get a bit that we like. Okay, that's got a couple of knots in it, so that's perfect. And then we can right click and done. Now we've done that for this one. Okay, I can then do a similar thing to each of the others. But hopefully, because this piece of texture stretches over about 3 or 4 of them, I shouldn't have to manipulate them too much. But I do have to apply this texture to the faces. Okay, so select it, double click to edit, double click and then triple click, and then B for your bucket. And it's the Alt on Windows, and I think it's Control on the Mac to sample that paint. And then we can click on that one. Then hit your space bar, and then just keep clicking on the next one. And B for bucket, you don't have to sample it anymore. And then just keep double clicking, triple clicking, B for bucket, double click, triple click, B for bucket. And what happens there is now we've got variation between each of these ones because it's stretching that timber. Okay, and if you don't like the way that two of them align, then you can just double click, select the surface, right click, texture, position, and then sort of move it to a different part, and then right click and done. And that's the way in which you can get away with it. Okay, so I'm just going to finish off these. Now what I did with these smaller bits is if I select this, double click and triple click, you notice that several of them have been picked, because it is possible to have a similar looking pattern but not notice it, especially if it's not too distinctive. So I'm going to B for bucket, click on that. I'll just check the way it looks, and that's not too bad. There is a knot there, so you might want to select texture and just reposition so these. So it's just a kind of a random boring one, and then that'll affect all of them. I'm just going along doing the same thing for each of these and see what we end up with. That's all right. There's a little bit here that looks similar, so I'm going to go in, select the surface, right click, texture, position, and just find sort of a better looking one that doesn't look so obvious. Right click, done. And there you go. So now we've got something that didn't take too long. We haven't got to create loads and loads of different textures. We just have to have a texture that allows a little bit of flexibility and can stretch and adjust. So, find yourself a good texture and then position it correctly on one, and then you should be away with the rest of them. Okay, so that's basically how we can make this look far more realistic. So what I'm going to do now is finish off applying textures to all of these other bits. And then at the beginning of the next lesson, I'll just run through exactly what's what on this model, and you can check to see how well you've done. Chapter 904, this is the completed model with all the textures applied. It took me about 20 minutes, I would say, to do all this. There were one or two little things that needed solving, but hopefully if you tackle this yourself, then you'll appreciate a couple of those little things. And I'll just run through what they were in this next couple of minutes. Okay, so we were okay up to here. We did all this. The ground was all done. So coming inside, I've got this finish here, which is the floor finish. Then we got the screed underneath that, and then we got the concrete underneath that. This is rebar as these. This is the DPM that we can see, and I've created some foil-backed insulation for the ground. So this is the blue insulation, and then double clicking on it, selecting this face and applying the foil. That gives us that sort of bumpy texture to the top. Inside, we've got plasterboard for there. This is sheetrock, and then we've got the finish on top, and that finish is this one down here, which is the polished concrete old. Okay, so that's that one. This is the floor finish, by the way, the concrete floor. This one here, concrete flooring. That's that one. We've got some more mesh here. I was going to sort out the join between the two, and then I've had to go in to this door and the threshold sill because it's kind of aluminium covered stuff, and I haven't shown the thickness of that, but you have to double click and then select this surface and then apply. I've applied the light timber plank to that because it's got a better grain to it, and again just to this surface here as well. So that was that bit done. So I think that was pretty much all we had to deal with. Oh, I've just noticed there's a little bit missing there, so I'll sort that out. This is the vapor barrier there. That goes sort of underneath the plasterboard. Then on top we've got the OSB vapor barrier, and then we've got our planks again, which I've kind of set out. I had to do a little bit of juggling with some of these battens, getting the texture to work. So there's a bit of orientation using the axis, and also then overriding some of the surfaces by digging in and selecting the surface and applying this lumber texture to it. The top, we've got some OSB here and here. We've got some insulation, and this is the Tyvek. So that's this one here. This one is the asphalt shingles. This one here. I had to also, I moved this down a little bit and rotated it from the corner up about 1 degree because it was sitting slightly underneath the Tyvek. So again, if you've had to do that, that's good. Brushed aluminium for these two things, and also all the trims brushed aluminium. We've got the stucco here, so that's this one down here, not the polished concrete. Then we've got screed and the scratch coat, more of the mesh, more insulation. Then we've got some brushed aluminium for that, and I think that was pretty much it. Okay, so good luck applying those textures. Hopefully it's not been too tricky a task. I'll just finish off that bit that I missed on this one, and then we can meet up in V-Ray. Okay, if you haven't got access to V-Ray, then obviously it's not necessary that you do that, but if you do want to be able to see how we can render this stuff up really nicely, then meet you there. If not, then I've already created some basic renders and some line work that we can have a look at overlaying in Photoshop. And once again, if you don't have access to Photoshop, then feel free to skip those bits and just pick up the bits at the end to add to the final sheets. But it's just that extra stage. Okay, what you could do with this is just file and then export a 2D graphic. What you can also do is use 2-point perspective to create a nice perspective render of this. So instead of having it rendered like this, where you lose a lot of the detail, you can zoom in a bit on this, maybe to a this point, and then set your camera to a 2-point perspective. You can move it up a little bit and try to get this blue line sort of lined up with something, maybe the edge of something. It's not massively important if it's pixel perfect, but it just saves a little bit of time later down the line when you are trying to line these things up in Photoshop, for example. So now with this image, we can export this as a 2D image. And then if we just pan up and try to keep that blue line sort of roughly in line with this point, then we can take another one of this middle section, and then we can push it up even further. And then we can take another one of this bit. Now this looks a bit weird, so maybe you'd want to set your 2-point perspective slightly differently. But that is a nice way of then being able to seamlessly tile these images in Photoshop or other image editor. Okay, so that's something I did for the renders. So we got a nice big image. It's always better to create a bigger image and scale it down than creating sort of a smaller image and scaling it up. Next up, I'm going to open up V-Ray. Now I've created a scene, so you can import the scene settings. So we won't be spending a lot of time sort of going through all the settings, but it should give you a sense of how easy it is to create some nice looking stuff from this model. Chapter 9.05, loading V-Ray render settings. We'll do a little bit more than just add the settings, but I've created 6 scenes here. 1, 2, and 3 are the 2-point perspective that run from top to bottom. Scene 4 is a view of the roof, the build-up. Scene 5, we're looking at the floor makeup, and then scene 6 is like an interior shot from a distance. Now, if you've got access to V-Ray, then this is the toolbar we want. Right-click and V-Ray for SketchUp. If you haven't, then you want to load it, then go to the Chaos group website. I'll put a link at the bottom, and then fire that up and then open it up. You should see several toolbars appear on your screen. Then just make sure you've got this one sort of ready. The others can sort of get turned off for the moment. And it's this one here that we want, the asset editor. So the V-Ray asset editor, this is the link to nearly all the bits and pieces. At the moment, we've got our settings turned on, but this one deals with the materials. This is to do with the lights. This is to do with our geometries, materials, and I'm not really sure what this is, layers or something. Anyway, if we look at the cog for the moment, the settings, we can load render settings from file. So we click on this thing here. This opens up the load render settings from file dialog box. And then we've got this one here, render settings VROPT in the chapter 9 materials and rendering, and then a folder called V-Ray. So inside there, let's click open. And now we've got our render settings that I have for this view. The image width and height, they're quite big. So these values are taken from the screen with high res, but I'm matching the viewport. This is kind of important because what we're going to do also is create line work, and then we can overlay in Photoshop. Okay, there's a save image path that we don't have to necessarily need to do anything with that, because we'll save them after we've rendered. The other thing to point out, if I expand out this one, and I can also expand out this one, if I click on the materials, it should already have all of the SketchUp materials loaded. Some of them are based on existing V-Ray materials, like the concrete flooring, for example, is one of these floors, I think. And it looks slightly different because this thing has changed to generic from floor. But if you want to see what it looks like as a floor texture, you can get a sense of how good the reflection is on these things, and whether there's things like displacement maps, which actually sort of bend the pixels, or whether it's just a bump map, which just gives the effect of a bumpy surface. And again, you can control the amount of bump by sort of you playing with these sliders. What I've also done for the settings, under my global illumination, so we've got this thing, it sometimes sits like this, but if you click on that and expand that out, we'll see that I've turned on ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion is really useful for visualization, especially the cracks and the corners. It'll add a little bit of dark or dirt to these things, and you can adjust the settings. The radius is quite small, and the amount is quite small as well. You can crank these things up and see what effect you get, but it does add a little bit of realism to the whole thing. So if you wanted to play around with some of these materials and swap them out, then make sure you got the material asset editor on. To add something to either the object on the model or to swap something out, let's say we want this earth thing swapped out, one of the V-Ray ones, then there's a ground section. I think if we come down, there's earth down here, or soil. So let's say we take this one here, soil A01, 200 centimeters. If we right click, then we can add to scene. Okay, so now soil A101, 200 is in the scene. What we could then do is right click on this and use as replacement. And then we can come up to our earth, click on that, and then right click and replace all references. So click on that, and then the earth should have changed out now from one to another. Whether I might have used soil in the first place, I'm not really sure. But anyway, that's the way of swapping materials out if you fancy something different. So let's just go back to our V-Ray editor. As far as rendering goes, this is where we click if we want to render the scene. We can also have interactive rendering. We can render to the cloud, and we can also export a V-Ray scene file. Okay, so all of these sorts of things that can be done. We should be okay with most of these materials. There are some, however, that you might want to bring in. You might find that things like mineral wool, for example, doesn't have the texture map, doesn't have the bitmap, these sorts of things. So what I did with my mineral wool was I saved asset to file. And if you haven't got the textures working, or you haven't got these files, then you can import asset file. So click on that, and then you've got mineral wool VR matte, so in the same V-Ray folder. So if I click on this one and open that up, then I've got mineral wool #1. So I'm going to right click on this, and I can either select the objects in the model and apply to selection, or I can use as a replacement again. So if I click on use as replacement and then go to my mineral wool, this one here, right click and then replace all references, and that will then update this thing. Okay, so feel free to play around with some of these textures. So there are a few that I've added that have things like bumps or displacement maps, and let's see how we get on. So go ahead and render these scenes if you want. Play around with some of the materials, swap things out, and see how you get on. Now, I've already done this process some time ago, so I'm going to use the files that I created back then. We'll also be generating some 2D line work in the SketchUp file, and then we can overlay those in Photoshop. So I'll see you in a bit where we'll stitch these together and also look at overlaying line work onto a rendered image. Chapter 906, we're going to create the overlay line files. It's a very simple process. All we need to do is open up our styles window and then set each one of our scenes that we rendered to this hidden line no cut style. Okay, so that's just given us a hidden line with some profiles. So profiles set to 2 and edges. That's all we've got on this. And with that set, we go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. So name it Scene 1. Save as type PNG. Okay, so that's the type you want to save it as. And then under the options, just make sure that the size of this image is corresponding to the size and aspect ratio of the rendered one. Anti-aliasing is fine. Transparent background, we'll leave that unchecked because the multiply blend mode gets rid of all the white anyway. And then we'll say, okay, then export. And you're done. So do that for each one of those. I've already done these, so you can pick them up for the next exercise where we'll be using Photoshop to splice together some of the images and then add these overlays. And you can then be the judge as to whether it's worth all this effort, or you might decide that simply having this looking like this is good enough for your needs. Okay, so now I'm in Photoshop and I'm just going to show you a very, very simple technique to enable us to add those lines as an overlay to the image. Okay, so we click on Open and we go to the Chapter 9 folder, so Materials and Rendering Images, and I've created some that I rendered some time ago. And if we take Base Detail and then add Base Lines and then click Open, then we get these two renders. Okay, so they should open up and look like the same size. We've got this one, Base Detail, and then we've got this one here, Base Lines. So with the Base Lines selected, just make sure you've got the sort of select or the move tool active. It's V on the keyboard. And then you can click and hold and drag up to this one. And it'll come back down into the middle somewhere. You can put your finger on the Shift key. That'll drop it exactly in the center of this. And if they're both the same size, then they should sit exactly on top of each other. So now we've got on our layers. So make sure you can see layers. I've got layer 2 sitting over layer 1. Okay, and turn these both back on. And all I want to do with layer 2, because it's black and white at the moment, is just change this blend mode. This thing here, change that from normal to multiply. And what that gives you is just the line work overlaying everything else. So it gives you a sharper edge and then shows some definition between the various bits of object. So it can be really, really useful, because when you render, you don't get that unless, of course, you create things called toon materials in V-Ray, and that will give you the line as well. But this is a much quicker way of doing it. The other benefit of doing it this way is that you've got an opacity slider for the multiply blend. So you can click this and decide how much of that blend you want to see. Okay, so I'll probably put it down to about 50 to 60%, something like that, just to give a little bit of a subtle edge to these things. It also highlights the planks a bit better. It shows the panes on the glass and sort of intimates at the transparency through this bit as well. So it is quite a nice little technique. The other thing, if you want to go a little bit flasher with it, is to put an overlay mask on maybe this layer. So select that one, click on this icon here. That's going to put a overlay mask, and then we can fade from one side to the other using a gradient fill. So what I'll do with my multiply is just turn that back to 100%, so we get the darkest possible edge. And with this layer 2 selected, I will then use my gradient tool, click on that, and we'll have this one set. And if I just drag from one side to the other, so click and hold and drag through. So what you're basically doing is applying a gradient to your layer mask. Then you get edges appearing here and they fade out towards this side. Okay, you can do it from the other end, from one side to the other. So click and hold and it'll swap it around. So maybe you want to pick up these edges more than these ones. So again, subtle differences. I'll not use this. I'll drag this into my bin. It's going to ask me if I want to apply, and I'll say delete, don't apply that. And then I'll just set my opacity back down to about sort of 60, 58%, something like that. And I'm happy with that. So then I will file and then come down to save as, and save it as a PNG, not a PSD. So PNG that, and then you can save it in there and call it base detail complete or base detail combined, something like that, and then save. In the next exercise, I'll just show you how you can combine the base, the mid, and the top to create a much bigger 3D view. In this next exercise, we're going to have a look at how to join those three images, so this top one, the middle one, and the bottom one, and combine them into one image. Okay, these are easy processes to do, but if you've never done this sort of thing before and you fancy a go, then this is how you do it. So first of all, we're going to open. So we want the base external, the mid external, and the top external. So just add those three to your selection. We don't want the lines. We can do those later if you want, and then click open. So that opens up these three images. So if we look at this top image and we go to the image menu across the top, then the canvas size is what we need to look at. And we can see that this canvas is 27 inches high. Okay, so it's quite a big old file to start off with. But we want to sort of triple this up so that we can have something that will take all three together. Now, we can allow for a little bit of crossover. So about 75 inches is going to be fine for this. And then say OK. And that makes a big old canvas. So I'm going to put my finger on the Alt key and scroll out, or you can use the scale at the bottom. And I'm just going to grab this and move it further up. Okay. So now I'm going to grab my mid external, click and hold and drag over to this tab, and then drop that in. And similarly, take this one, click and hold over to this one and drop that in as well. So now we've got all three in this view. And all we've got to do now is zoom in a bit and then line these things up. So find out where you're going to line them up. So you can take this edge. This might be a good place to start, or some other point, maybe this one here. And you can move in quite a lot. And then you should find that using the arrow keys, you can nudge them into position. And that should be fine for that one. Just see a little bit of overlay there. And then I'm going to pan down, finger on the space bar and your finger on the left mouse button. That allows you to pan. And then we'll zoom in on this. And again, you can decide whether to have these above or below. So this is layer 1 at the moment. Okay, so I can move that. If I move this up the stack, then it's going to appear above it. I'll just drag it below the stack. I don't think it really matters. And then we've got this little bit of flashing and this edge that we can look at. So we'll zoom right in on this and then nudge these across using the arrow keys till we've got the thing lining up pretty nicely. Okay, so that's that one. So I can zoom out. So now we can probably merge them all together. So select all three, right click and merge layers. That's going to merge them into one thing. And then we can crop. So now we've got one image. We can then use the crop tool and just drag it up a little bit at the bottom, drag it in from the side, just you minimizing the sizes of it, and then hit enter. That's going to crop it, and then we save it as. Okay, so you could do a similar thing then with the overlay lines, just to give it a little bit of sharpness, but that's the perspective. So we go from sort of looking down at this bit to looking up at this bit. So it does give us a nice looking view showing everything using that 2D perspective, or the 2-point perspective, should I say. And the other good thing about 2-point perspective is it straightens up all these lines, whereas the 3-point perspective throws this vertical line off at an angle as well. So it's another nice way to create sort of good looking details that cover a lot of territory. Chapter 909, we are nearly finished this. We are going to create our cover page. We're going to combine some 2D line work with our 3D details. Now, do not fear, it is not going to end up looking like this. The intention is that it's going to look like this, the cover page of our completed sheets. Okay, so we'll create this effect, and we'll bring in one of our details, and we'll change the lines and get rid of the fills, etc. Okay, so I know that you can create rectangles with rounded edges. I know you can type text, and I know you can draw circles. So I really thought there was no need in doing all of those things again. I've set these up. I've used the align feature to make sure they're all aligned and spaced correctly. And so all we need to do, if you can't see, just a little aside, if you can't see these images, then just check where they are located. Go to File, Document Setup, and then you should see sort of missing links if you have got them missing links. Okay, so just select them. It'll highlight the one that is missing, and then just relink. And you'll find these in the Chapter 9 images folder. Okay, this one's called Base Details Combined. This one is called Middle Detail Combined. And this one originally is called Roof Detail Combined. Okay, so easy to find. Just make sure they're relinked, and then you should see these things there. To create the clipping mask, you simply select the circle and the image, and then you right click, create clipping mask. So that's 1, 2, and 3. Now you might find that the edge doesn't show, okay, when you create the clipping mask, because you might find that the stroke is turned off or the fill is turned on and then the stroke's turned off. So you might find that you end up looking something like that. Okay, so all you need to do is turn the stroke on and set it to, I've set it to 2 point. That will be fine. All right, so now we've got that nice and neat. What we're going to do next is go down to our scrapbooks, and the Canada House scrapbook, we are on the window wall detail. So you can drag this in. We'll just drop it there. I can close that, and I'll set the scale on this initially to 1 to 12. Okay, this one here, 1 inch equals 1 foot, because that's nearly the right size. It's somewhere between 1 to 12 and 1 to 15. We are not going to scale it exactly. We're going to put a sort of random scale on this, just so it fits nicely on this. As long as we've got not to scale at the front, then we should be fine. Okay, so with this selected, up to our shape style, and we'll just turn fill off. That's done quite a lot of the work for us. We then select it again, and our stroke, just click on this button and click on the black. So that should sort the rest of it out. And then we've still got this thing for some reason. So select it again and just untick fill again. And that should sort the rest of it out. Okay, so that's 3 clicks and we're nearly done. For the color, let's change the stroke color to white. So just click on one of these or click and drag into this box. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky. And for the stroke width, just set it to 0.1. Okay, so a nice thin line. And then drag it across to here and leave it there. So it's looking quite nice at the moment. Make sure also that it's on the line type layer or the line work layer, because so are these. And if we right click and send to back, then we'll just sit it underneath these things. Okay, again, these sorts of things quite important. The final thing to do is right click and remove scale. We don't want to ungroup it, we just want to remove the scale, and then we can click the corner and kind of position it and stretch it a little bit. No one's going to know except for you and I. And then we can sort of adjust the position of this, maybe drop it down a little bit. And we maybe have to just push this up again just a touch. Okay, so looking fine. Okay, so that's really all we needed to do. And now we've got our details cover page, which is part of the rest of it. So we've got our plans and sections on this one. So this is then showing us where the sections are cut. We're then highlighting the main sections on that. And then we go to our details, and then we've got our details highlighted with the details on them. And then I've added some text, as you can see, to this. Okay, a lot of this stuff is repeated this side, so there's absolutely no need to keep adding that text. But I've done my best to try to sort of itemize as many things as possible in there. There might be some bits that I've missed, but you will get the picture. The main thing is to try and make it as neat and as tidy and as legible as you possibly can. So all we've got to do now is look at our export options and our print options, and then we can draw this series to a close, and let's look at our next steps.